He broke every bone in her body, and she whispered his name with each snap. They said the house was silent, except for the sound of bones. Not screams, not cries for help, just a rhythm of cracking, snapping, splintering. To anyone walking by in the dark, it might have sounded like old wood giving way, the beams of collapsing roof, the groan of furniture under strain. But inside it was flesh and bone, and a voice that trembled between agony and devotion. She had always whispered his name. From the first time they met, her lips carried it like a prayer. At first, it was innocent, affectionate, the way lovers taste each other's names like wine. But as his hunger grew darker, her whisper did not fade. It deepened.
Please.
It lingered. Even when the pain began, even when the first rib cracked beneath his palm, she murmured it, soft, shaky, but deliberate, as though each fracture was a vow renewed. He had not meant for it to start that way. He had touched her gently once, kissed her shoulder, traced his fingers down her arm. But in his touch was something heavy, something that pressed too deep. The first snap was an accident, or so he told himself. Her collarbone giving way beneath his grasp like a twig.
Please.
He expected to scream, to pull away, the horror. Instead, she looked at him with tears brimming in her eyes and whispered his name, faint but steady, like the syllables themselves carried her away from the agony. That whisper intoxicated him more than her pain, more than her tears. It bound him. From that night on, it was not love in the ordinary sense. It was worship. She gave him her body like kindling to fire, and he consumed it piece by piece. Each night, another crack. Her arms, her legs, her ribs. He learned the sound each bone made, how some split sharply while others groaned and bent before they snapped. And always, always she whispered, sometimes through clenched teeth, sometimes through broken breath, sometimes in a voice that was hardly more than air, but always his name. He grew obsessed with it. He began to test her, to see how far her devotion would reach. He broke her fingers one by one, listening as she whispered between the cracks. He twisted her ankle until the joint tore apart, and she moaned his name like it was salvation. He pressed his knee into her chest until her sternum caved, and even then, choking on blood, she tried to say it. The syllables came out wet, gurgled, but still they were his. The neighbors never suspected. She was rarely seen outside, and when she was, her frailty was mistaken for illness. He carried her in his arms as though he was protecting her, not destroying her. To them, he was a devoted husband, a caretaker, a man who never left her side. But behind closed doors, the truth unfolded in fragments of bone. And she changed, too. The more he broke her, the less she resisted, the less her body seemed to belong to her at all. Her skin became pale, her movements slow, her frame collapsing in on itself. But her voice remained. Sometimes he would find himself listening for it, even when he wasn't touching her. In the silence of night, she would whisper his name into the dark, as if begging for him to come again, to continue, to never stop. He began to believe she wanted it, that she craved it, that each snap of her bones brought her closer to something divine. And perhaps it did. Perhaps in her pain she found a kind of clarity that others could not understand. When her spine gave way under his hands, she arched in a convulsion that looked almost like ecstasy, whispering his name as though she were on the edge of revelation. He could not stop. Even when he told himself it had to end, that her body could not possibly take more, he was drawn back. She fed him with that whisper, the sound of it echoing in his mind long after the breaking was done. He became afraid that one day she would fall silent, that the next snap would end her voice forever. And yet, when he looked at her, her lips parted, waiting, ready to shape his name again. It was not love. It was not cruelty. It was something in between, something older, something that lived in the marrow of her bones and the hunger in his hands. And so the house stayed quiet to the world outside. No cries, no pleas. Just a steady sound of bones breaking and a voice, faint but unyielding, whispering his name with each and every snap. He started to learn her body the way others might learn an instrument. Each joint, each limb, each fragile curve of bone had its own music, its own sound. The small bones of her hands made a delicate rhythm, a sharp staccato of snaps that reminded him of dry twigs. Her ribs were different, hollow, resonant, like the frame of a drum. Her legs were deeper, thunderous when they gave way, the sound carrying through her as if she were an empty vessel. But the spine, oh, the spine was his obsession. He loved the way each vertebra seemed to beg for attention, stacked like beads on a string. He would press his thumbs along her back, feeling each one rise under the skin, each little knob of bone waiting for him. She trembled when he touched her there, not from fear, but anticipation. Her whisper grew quicker, more urgent, like prayer turning into chant. When he pushed too far, when one of the vertebrae gave a dull crack and shifted out of place, her voice broke, but even then, it broke only to form his name. Sometimes she smiled through the pain. Her lips split, her teeth bloodied, but her eyes gleamed with something that frightened him. It was not submission. It was devotion, a devotion so deep that she seemed to welcome the breaking, as though she believed every bone he shattered brought her closer to him, bound her tighter to him. He wondered if she even knew where she ended, and he began any more. Nights bled into one another. He lost track of how many bones he had broken. He told himself he kept count, but the truth was her body had become something unrecognizable, something fragile and twisted, yet still alive, always alive, breathing shallowly, whispering. Sometimes he thought she should have died long ago. No body could survive this, but hers did, as though her bones healed only so they could be broken again. He tested that theory once. He left her untouched for a week. He watched her, fed her, let her lie in the bed while her body tried to knit itself back together. And every night she whispered his name. At first it was soft, pleading, then it grew louder, desperate, until finally she screamed it, her voice cracking as her body trembled. When he could no longer resist, when he placed his hand against her arm and twisted, snapping the bone once more, she let out a moan so deep it rattled the room. She collapsed into herself with a smile, whispering his name as though she had been saved. That was when he realized she did not want to heal. Healing was agony to her. The breaking was her relief. He began to wonder if her whisper was still hers at all. Sometimes, when he listened too closely, it seemed layered, as though another voice spoke with hers. His name came from her lips, yes, but beneath it, deeper, there was something else. A shadow of sound that did not belong to her throat. At night in the silence, he swore he could hear it even when she slept. A faint whisper from cracks in her bones, a vibration from within her marrow. Always his name, always calling. He could not sleep anymore. The sound followed him into dreams, into waking, into the spaces between breaths. He would walk to the halls of the house and hear it echoing, as though the walls themselves carried her voice. He would open doors, convinced she was whispering from another room, only to find her still lying where he left her, her lips barely moving, her body too broken to rise. Sometimes, when he woke in the dark, she was beside him, closer than she should have been, her broken limbs curled awkwardly, her face pressed against his shoulder. He had not carried her there. He knew he had not. And yet, there she was, whispering in her sleep, his name, always his name. He began to question whether he was still the one in control. The breaking had once been his choice, his hunger. Now it felt as though she was guiding it, her whispers pulling him into each act. His hands moved as though commanded. His ears rang with her voice until he obeyed. Sometimes, when he hesitated, her eyes would open wide, too wide, and she would whisper his name in a tone that left no room for refusal. He had wanted her body. Now it seemed her body wanted him. And still, the sound of bones breaking filled the house. Slow, steady, inevitable. With each snap, her whisper grew louder, clearer, as though his name was no longer spoken by a dying woman, but by something vast, something eternal, wearing her like a vessel. And he could not stop. He began to notice that her body no longer looked quite human. At first it was subtle, things he could almost explain away. A rib that seemed sharper than it should have been, jutting beneath her skin like a blade. Her fingers, bent and twisted from being broken too many times, resembling claws more than hands. Her eyes lingered too long on him, their gaze unblinking, shining with something feverish. But the real change came with the sound. The whisper was no longer confined to her lips. When he leaned close, pressing his ear against her chest, he swore he could hear it inside her bones. Each fracture became a mouth, each split a new voice. His name poured from her like a chorus, whispered through marrow and crack, echoing out of every wound he had left in her. He should have been horrified. He should have fled. Yet he stayed, compelled, trembling with both fear and need. The house itself seemed to tremble with the sound of her devotion. Sometimes the wooden beams above him groaned and shifted as though whispering with her. Sometimes the floorboards beneath his feet creaked in rhythm with her voice. His name was everywhere now, breathed by the walls, the air, the very bones of the home itself. One night he tried to stop, truly stop. He tied her down, not to hurt her but to keep her still, to prevent himself from touching her again. He locked himself in another room, far from her, and stuffed his ears with cloth. But still he heard it, faint at first, like a memory, then louder, pushing past the cotton, drilling into his skull. His name, his name, his name. His blood roared with it. His teeth ached with it. He staggered back to her door, hands shaking, and when he opened it, she was there, broken, mangled, but smiling. She had chewed through the restraints. Her jaw was cracked from the effort, teeth shattered and bleeding, but she had done it. She lay in a pool of herself, eyes wide and glowing in the moonlight, and when she saw him, she whispered again. He didn't remember crossing the room. He didn't remember lifting her. All he remembered was the sound of her bones breaking once more in his hands, and the way his name spilled out of her like a hymn. From that night on, she began to change faster. Her bones healed in ways they should not have. Her arms bent at strange angles, but they still reached for him. Her spine curled and twisted, but it allowed her to crawl across the floor with unnatural grace. The more he broke her, the more she seemed to grow into something new, something that was not quite woman anymore. Her skin stretched thin, almost translucent, veins glowing faintly beneath as if something inside her was shining outward. And always, the whispers multiplied. He would wake in the middle of the night to find dozens of voices around him, all whispering his name in unison. He would search the house, frantic, only to realize the voices came from her body, from the fractures he had given her. Every bone was a mouth, every crack a throat. Sometimes she stood at the foot of the bed when he woke, though she should not have been able to stand at all. Her broken legs twisted beneath her, but still she held herself upright, head tilted, lips moving. His name, over and over. Her shadow stretched long across the wall, too long, moving even when she was still. He started to dream of bones. Endless hallways built from them, walls of femurs, ceilings of ribs, floors paved with skulls. And through every hall he heard her whisper, guiding him deeper, deeper, promising him something beyond the breaking. And when he woke, she was always closer, always watching, always whispering. One night, as he held her in his arms, her voice finally changed. For the first time, she spoke something more than his name. Her lips moved slow, deliberate, blood bubbling between her teeth. "Break the last one," she whispered, "and I'll be yours forever." His heart stopped. He knew what she meant. The skull, the final cage. And her eyes never left his, glowing faintly in the dark, as if daring him. His hands hovered above her face, trembling. He could still feel the warmth of her breath against his palms, though it was faint, shallow, as if her lungs no longer remembered how to work properly. Her jaw hung loose, cracked when she had chewed through her restraints. Yet when she spoke, the words came smooth, chilling, deliberate. "Break the last one." He could not look away from her eyes. They were no longer human eyes. The whites had gone gray, threaded with black veins that pulsed faintly with each heartbeat, as though something alive and alien swam inside. Her pupils had stretched into slits, long and thin, reflecting the dim light like glass. And yet they glowed with devotion. She was smiling at him, as though this were a wedding vow, as though he were about to seal their union. His fingers brushed her temple. He felt the faint outline of her skull beneath paper-thin skin. It pulsed with her whispers. Not just his name now. He could hear fragments of words, too fast, too layered to understand. a language that bled into his ears and left a taste of iron on his tongue. Every fracture he had ever made seemed to echo here, culminating, waiting for this last act. He hesitated. His stomach churned with terror. But deeper than terror was longing. He realized in that instant that he could no longer imagine silence. He could not imagine a world without her whisper. If he refused, she might fall quiet. If he broke her skull, she might speak forever. "Do it," she begged, her broken lips peeling back in a grin too wide for her ruined face. "Set me free." He pressed his thumbs to her head, feeling the hard curve of bone beneath. She tilted into his hands, sighing like a lover about to be kissed. He pressed harder. There was resistance, like the bone itself fought back, but the whisper urged him on, flooding his mind, drowning him in his own name, louder and louder, until it was no longer a whisper at all but a roar. Snap! The sound was sharp, final. Her skull gave way beneath his hands. And then silence. For the first time in months, maybe years. He heard nothing. No whisper. No prayer. No echo of his name. He gasped, stumbling back, his hands shaking and slick with blood. She lay limp before him, her body mangled beyond comprehension, her head cracked open, her mouth slack. He thought it was over. Then she moved. Her body convulsed, limbs snapping and reshaping themselves as though every bone he had broken was reassembling according to some other design. Her jaw unhinged, falling wider than any human mouth could stretch. From a split in her skull, light spilled out, not bright, not pure, but a dim, pulsing glow, the color of rotting marrow. And from that glow came the voices, not whispers anymore. A chorus, his name, screamed by thousands of throats, layered and endless, rising and falling in waves until the air itself vibrated with it. He staggered back, clapping his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside him now, rattling his teeth, shaking his bones. He could feel it in his marrow, in the core of him, as though his skeleton were being spoken to directly. She rose. Not stood, rose. Her shattered legs dragged uselessly beneath her, but her body lifted into the air as if pulled by invisible strings. Her spine arched, her head tilted back, and the light from her skull split the room into jagged shadows. And then, for the first time, she spoke clearly. "You are mine." The walls cracked. The floor shuddered. He felt his own bones ache, bending beneath his skin, straining as though ready to break. He screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the chorus that thundered from her body. She was no longer whispering his name. She was writing it into him, carving it into the marrow of his bones, until he felt each snap inside his own body. And with every fracture, every scream of his skeleton, he whispered back, because he could not stop himself. He whispered her name, though he did not know what it was, though it came unbidden from his lips, a sound older than language, older than pain. The house was full of breaking bones that night, not just hers. He felt it begin in his hands first, a trembling in the knuckles, a soft resistance, as though his bones had suddenly grown too brittle for the weight of his own skin. He gasped as his fingers bent back with a sickening pop. Pain shot up his arms, but beneath the pain there was something else. Pleasure, terrifying and undeniable, the same twisted ecstasy he had seen in her eyes when he broke her. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his arms, but they continued to snap. One bone at a time, a grotesque rhythm that matched the chant pouring from her body. He looked up at her, floating above him, her broken form illuminated by the glow seeping from her skull. Her grin stretched impossibly wide now, lips torn at the corners, blood dripping down her chin like ink. "Yes," she whispered, though the word was not her own anymore. It was 1,000 voices speaking through her. "Yes, become mine." His ribs cracked next, one after the other. They split like kindling, each fracture accompanied by a shudder of breath he couldn't control. He wheezed, coughed blood, and yet with every snap, a word forced itself from his throat. Her name, not his, not anymore. Her name, ancient and jagged, syllables that shredded his tongue. It spilled out of him like a prayer he had always known, though he had never heard it until now. Her laughter filled the house, a hollow rattling that seemed to come not from her mouth, but from every wall, every floorboard, every beam of wood. The house itself groaned, bending and creaking as if its structure were bone as well, and it too was beginning to break. His legs gave way. He felt the femur snap, heard the grinding splinter of his knees shattering beneath his own weight. He fell forward, hands useless, face striking the blood-soaked floor. His jaw cracked on impact, hanging loose as he gasped her name again, louder this time, no longer in resistance but in devotion. Her voice grew deeper. Not a whisper anymore, not even a chorus. It was a command, a summons, every bone. And his body obeyed. His spine twisted with thunderous crack, forcing his back into an arch so unnatural he thought it would tear his skin apart. His collarbone split, his shoulders dislocated, his arms bent behind him until they resembled wings of shattered glass. He screamed, but his scream was not his own. It was hers, her voice tearing out his throat, a sound that shook the windows in their frames. He looked up at her, or tried to, his neck bending at an impossible angle, and saw her descending. Her limbs dangled uselessly, broken, mangled, but the glow within her pulled her down like a star falling from heaven. Her face leaned close to his, their blood mixing as she pressed her ruined lips against his. And in that kiss, he felt a final snap. His skull cracked from within, a fissure splitting through bone as though his head were nothing more than an eggshell. His vision blurred, black and white, and then only the glow of her light spilling inside him. And with that final break, the whisper stopped. Silence, but not absence. The silence was full, heavy. He realized with horror and awe that he could still feel her, but not outside him anymore. She was in his marrow, his fractures, his skull. Every bone she had broken in him was now a mouth, whispering not to him, but as him. He opened his mouth, and her voice came out. He moved his hand, what was left of it, and saw his fingers tremble like her fingers once had. His body bent the way hers had bent, twisted and fragile, but strong in ways he could not understand. And then he heard it, from the cracks in the walls, from the beams in the ceiling, from the very foundation of the house. Other whispers, not hers, not his, new ones, answering, calling. They had heard. The whispers outside the walls grew louder, surrounding the house like a storm. He dragged himself to the window, his limbs contorting in unfamiliar ways, his body no longer his own. Through the cracks in the glass, he saw shapes moving in the dark, figures bent and crooked, crawling on twisted arms, their bones jutting out at impossible angles. Their mouths were open, whispering the same name that had consumed him. They were coming, drawn to the sound, to the ritual, to the breaking. He turned back toward her, toward what she had become. She hovered in the center of the room, her body little more than a vessel of glowing fractures, her mouth moving without sound. But he didn't need to hear it. He understood. She had passed herself into him. He was no longer apart from her. He was part of her chorus, her hymn, her worship. The walls groaned as the figures outside pressed against them. The whispers multiplied, filling the air until there was no silence left in the world. He felt his own bones begin to pulse with a rhythm, aching to break again, to fracture into more mouths. And as the first of the creatures clawed its way through the wood, spilling into the room on limbs that cracked with every movement, he understood the truth. It would never end. Every bone broken was another voice, every fracture another mouth, every whisper another chain pulling the world into her. He opened his mouth one last time, and though his lips formed her name, what came out was not a whisper, but a roar that shook the night and called the others in. The house collapsed under the weight of them all, groaning, snapping, breaking, until it was nothing but rubble and bone. And in the silence that followed, the whispers spread, through the soil, through the air,